Okay, so we're going to be working on our retrieval, looking and finding information from the text. How can we locate it? We're going to be thinking about inferring again. Again, thinking about what do I think about the character based on what's been written. However, we're also going to be thinking what choices has the writer made, what's their viewpoint, what do they want the reader to think about what they have done. Inference. We're going to be thinking about what inference really is. We're going to look at the text. Here you can see a few sentences from a different story, something to try and demonstrate what we really mean by inference. As he peered down, he realised the ice cream had melted too quickly, and he was covered in it. He could hear his mum. He locked the bathroom door behind him and looked frantically around for some soap. Now, when we're inferring, we read the text carefully, and then we think, what does our brain tell us? What do I know? What are my experiences in life or other things that I have read that give me an insight into what this character's thinking, feeling at the moment? First of all, I know ice cream is messy when it melts. As a child and as a grown-up, I have managed to spill melted ice cream down myself or got it all around my face. He was covered in it and then he hid. As a child, when I've spilt something either on the floor or down myself or over the table, I did have occasions when I hid from my parents. He must be worried if he's looking frantically. Yeah, if you're searching for something, you need it to happen really quickly. So if he could hear his mum and he suddenly starts looking quickly, that's going to start my brain thinking. Now, he was looking for some soap. It doesn't go on to tell us what for, but I know that soap is used for cleaning. So what is that going? What am I going to infer from the text and what my brain is telling me I know about what it says? Here's my inference. I think he's worried about mum seeing ice cream all over him. So he's hiding and using the soap to get rid of the evidence. Either he isn't allowed ice cream. I know when I was younger, my mum or dad would often say to me, "You're not allowed that now." So maybe he did something he wasn't supposed to, he was told not to. Or he's wearing something he needs to keep clean. Sometimes if I'm going somewhere nice with my son, I will say to him, please don't eat that now. You need to keep your clothes nice for later. So that experience that I've had or that I've read about in other stories has helped me to understand that that's why he's frantically looking for soap and hiding for his mum. He doesn't want to get caught. He doesn't want to get into trouble. Okay, let's think about some vocabulary now that's going to help us with what we're reading. Here's the word normal. You've probably heard that word a lot, but what does it really mean? Often people use the word normal to mean what's normal to them, not perhaps what's normal to everybody. So we have to be really careful when we're thinking about what normal is. Normal is relative to who it is that's speaking. Nonsense. So nonsense means not to be, and then sense, sensible, not to be sensible. Beefy. Now, as the word has the word beef inside it, this is the image it conjures up. This is a bull, which we refer to the meat of the bull as beef, or cattle we refer to as beef, and often we think of them as very chunky and large, very muscular. So if the word beefy is used to describe something, it's often because it's large or chunky or muscular. Here we've got the word craning. It conjures up an image of a crane, as you can see in the picture here, which is used to carry or lift or lower something that's very, very heavy. But here is someone who is craning her neck to see over something, to see what she can see on the other side. And it's really important that you understand why they've used the word craning, because it's like a crane, to be able to see over something that's very high. Okay, so as we go through this, I'm going to talk through the inference aspect using the text and my brain to help me infer and really think about it from the writer's point of view. Why have they chosen that? So here's the first part of chapter 1. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. Okay, now it says we're proud to say. So the writer's giving us the impression that these are proud people. They think that they are great and the way that they live is very, very good. It also has the words perfectly normal. Perfectly meaning absolutely, without any flaws or errors. Normal, again, the way that they live their life, they think they're perfectly normal. They think that they are amazing. They then follow it up with thank you very much. Thank you very much is quite a sarcastic phrase. They were perfectly normal, thank you very much. Sarcasm is an unkind use of language. Therefore, when people have said it to me or I've read it in a book, it often makes me feel that the characters are quite unkind. This gives me the impression that the writer wants us to think of Mr. and Mrs. Dursley as quite unkind people, however proud they are of themselves. Okay, the next section. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Now, things that are strange or mysterious often draw us in. We're curious, we want to find out more. This tells me that the Dursleys are not curious. They don't want to find out more. They're not interested in learning about anything. That means they're probably not interested in learning about other people or listening to them, listening to their lives. Again, another indication that they're probably not very accepting of other people, especially if they live in a different way at all to them. Therefore, again, I believe that the writer is giving us the impression that Mr. and Mrs. Dursley are not very kind and generous because they're not interested in other people. And I get that from the last people to be involved in anything strange or mysterious. It then says at the bottom, they just didn't hold with such nonsense. This tells me that they're not very understanding. If something awful were to happen, they probably wouldn't try and find out why or understand someone. They would probably just ignore them or be very angry with them. Therefore, the writer is giving me the impression that they haven't got time for anybody else. Okay, here's the next section. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. Well, first of all, the clue from the text says the director of a firm. Now, a director is someone who is in charge. People that are in charge are often very bossy. This clue tells me that Mr. Dursley is probably quite a bossy person then. And I think the writer is trying to give us the impression that he's not very nice. He was a big beefy man with hardly any neck. Again, another clue to show us that he's quite big. He's probably quite domineering. People that are a lot bigger than other people often can be quite intimidating in stories and films. Although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. So, first of all, spent so much of her time craning over garden fences. Now, craning over garden fences, as we talked about already, is about looking over something that's quite tricky to look over. My brain tells me if it's quite difficult to do that, then this person really wants to see what's going on the other side. So I think the writer is giving us the impression that Mrs. Dursley is quite nosy because she spends a lot of time craning over garden fences. Spying on the neighbours, well, that's quite rude. It's an invasion of privacy. I think that the writer is trying to give us the impression that Mrs. Dursley is a gossip, that she wants to know what's going on in everyone else's lives. And I doubt that she would keep that to herself. I'm sure she would tell everybody if she heard anything that was interesting. Okay. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in their street. Here is some vocabulary to help you understand the text. So we've got the word finer, which means greater or better than. Bear, this doesn't mean the grisly kind. This means to cope with something or to be able to do something without being overwhelmed or fall apart. And shuddered means that they shook, or to shudder, which means to shake. I'm going to pull up some questions now. Each time I finish reading the question, I'm going to use the text to help me answer it. If you don't want to hear my answer first because you'd like to have a go, you can pause the video. Here's question 1. True or false? Mrs. Potter and Mrs. Dursley were not very close. Well, let's have a look at what it says about Mrs. Potter and Mrs. Dursley. First of all, here are the words Mrs. Potter. Mrs. Potter and was Mrs. Dursley's sister. So, they are sisters. However, when it says not very close, here there's another clue. They hadn't met for several years. Now, if you were close to someone, it might mean that you live near them, or it might mean that you have a good relationship where you talk a lot to each other. It said they haven't met. I'm going to read on a bit. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister. Well, that's not very kind to pretend that your sister doesn't exist. Therefore, she often must act as if she doesn't have a sister, which is quite unkind, and she probably doesn't phone her or speak to her at all. So the answer is false. Sorry, true. Mrs. Potter and Mrs. Dursley were not very close. As I said above, Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister. So it is true. Mrs. Potter and Mrs. Dursley were not very close. Question 2. What does the phrase, "in their opinion there was no finer boy," suggest about Dudley? We're going to do question 2 first. So, in their opinion, let's find that. That's up here. In their opinion, there was no finer boy. Well, the phrase, "in their opinion, there was no finer boy," suggests that Dudley was very loved by his mother and father. Now, previously, we've learnt that the Dursleys are quite unkind people. They don't accept differences in others. They like the way they live and they think that everybody should be perfectly normal like they are. So if they think their son is amazing, this implies that they love their son and they think he's amazing, but I'm not sure that I would agree. So it suggests that Dudley is probably not a very fine boy at all. What impression does the writer give you of Mrs. Dursley? Okay, so let's have a look for some more clues here. What does it say about Mrs. Dursley? Well, let's come back to this. She pretended she doesn't have a sister. That tells me that she's quite unkind. I think the writer wants me to see her as an unkind person. It also says the Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in their street. Now, we already know that Mrs. Dursley likes to spy on her neighbours. So if they were to spy on her back and see the Potters, she would be ashamed. Again, I think that the Dursleys are very worried about what other people think. I think that the writer's given us the impression that Mrs. Dursley is very judgmental of other people and how they live, and therefore she's very ashamed and feels judged when the Potters arrive because they demonstrate a way of life that she doesn't like. And question 4. Does the writer like the Dursley family? Use evidence from the text to support your answer. Okay, so let's find some more clues. First of all, we'll go back to that pretended she didn't have a sister. She called her sister's husband a good-for-nothing husband. We've already learnt that the Dursleys think that they are amazing and they like to spy on other people. All these clues indicate that the writer doesn't like the Dursley family and would not want to live next to the Dursley family. Okay, I hope that this helps you to think carefully about questions for your comprehension, and I look forward to seeing you at the live sessions.